So,
Hi, Vanessa.
hi, Cara. We realized something that I have to say, I'm like kind of embarrassed that it took us so long to realize.
I'm gobsmacked. I'm going to use that word.
So, one of the biggest things we talk about, like we literally spoke to thousands of people about it across the country during our book tour. And there's a whole chapter about it in our book. And there's a whole bucket about it in our parent membership. And there's several lessons about it in our school curriculum.
And we talked to people about it on television every TV appearance.
Every TV appearance.
It was either porn or this. Fill in the blank. What's this?
I mean, ding, ding, who can guess? We have not done an episode on mood swings. I feel like there's podcasting negligence that we have failed to do an episode on mood swings while talking about it at this point to millions of people, because between the TV shows and the podcast episodes and everything else, it's astounding.
It's enough to put one in a bad mood.
But luckily, we're not in a bad mood.
We're in a great mood
because we love talking about mood swings and making adults feel like they can handle the mood swings of the kids in their house. And I will share this. And Cara, I don't think I've ever shared this. I was a very moody, volatile kid and tween. Very.
I wouldn't have guessed that. See,
nobody would guess that.
Which goes to show it does mellow out.
I say that. And also, Nick was a very moody, volatile kid, which is probably why we got along so well, because we were just like a volcano of emotion hiding behind our Archie comics. But I say all that to make people feel like this stage of life, it does pass. Like what you are dealing with right now, whatever it looks like, if it looks like silence or seething anger or just uncontrollable tears or laughter at the most inappropriate moments, or just like emoting in every corner of every moment of your life, I swear to you, it passes.
For most. I'm
still an expressive person. I'm still an emotional person.
Yes, but we have to just acknowledge there is a world in which there are mood disorders in adulthood, and there are people who struggle with these things.
I'm not talking about mental health disorders. No, I'm talking about the moodiness of puberty in tweens and teens, which feels like it's never going away.
Okay, I have a story. Here's my story. It has nothing to do with moods, but you'll see why I'm sharing it. My son went to go stay with a friend the other day. Let's just say the two things that my son does or doesn't do repeatedly at home, which are big buttons for me. He doesn't make his bed without being asked, which makes me bananas. And he doesn't close a cupboard door. Like, when he's been in a room because every cupboard door is open. And he went to stay with another family. And I got the funniest text last night from the mom saying, I just want you to know, unsolicited, every single morning when he wakes up, his bed is made and the room is impeccable. And I almost cried. I say this in the context of a mood swings episode, because the other thing is it's easy to assume that the child who presents with mood swings that we are going to explain in a minute are completely biologically driven, right? They're physiologic responses to hormones, that because there's an uncontrollability to it, they must do this outside the home too, right? And the answer is no, not necessarily. That sometimes, in fact, oftentimes, the moods swing, yes, because of hormonal surges, but also yes, because you are the trusted adult. You are the person they feel safe with. They can let the guard down with you, and they don't do this in other people's homes. And I just want to reassure you, they're maybe not making beds, but they're not mood swinging.
So, Cara, let's start with a review of the science of what causes mood swings. So there's this very cool thing which people may not know, even people who've read the book, because there's 100,000 words in the book and they might not remember all of them, which
Although
is
many of them are the word mood.
Lots of,
Just saying.
probably about like 15%. So quick primer. Hormones are chemical messengers in the body. They are sent from a gland to another part of the body to do a job, which I'm a hormone. Like, I feel like my whole life is like being sent from one place to another to do a
To
job.
do your job. That
And
is
like,
awesome.
And they're not, so kids, when we work with kids, we often say to kids, like, what are hormones, or what does hormonal mean? And they know of the concept of hormones in the context actually of puberty. And
That's right.
they don't know often that there's tons of hormones all over the body doing many different jobs, and they're sent from glands all over the body. So that's one thing we really like to normalize for everybody, that hormones are not just the sex hormones that cause us to be moody. There's many, many different hormones doing many jobs.
And in fact, you've just done a phenomenal job of defining what a hormone is. I mean, that is what you just said, secreted by a gland, goes elsewhere to do its job and exert its impact. That is the definition of a hormone.
Because I heard you say it, hundreds of times.
But you did a great job. And some examples of non-sex hormones that are extraordinarily important in our everyday life include insulin, which is in charge of pulling sugar out of the bloodstream into the cells in order for that sugar to then be able to be used as energy by the cells. It just sort of unlocks the door to the cell. Insulin does. Growth hormone, it does more than its name implies, but it certainly is involved with growth. I don't even know how many hormones there are. I've got to imagine it's on the order of dozens. There are hormones involved with metabolism, everything from thyroid hormone to leptin and ghrelin and other. And we're constantly identifying new hormones all the time. Anything that is secreted in one part of the body that moves to another part of the body to do its job is a hormone. Okay. Now,
and
Vanessa,
the reason we emphasize this, particularly with kids, is because we want to normalize the whole experience of having things rise and fall, surge and drop in response to other things happening in the body. And we don't want to just demonize mood swings and the cycling of hormones in the body related to puberty, because then it makes it feel like, oh, well, it's just this one yucky thing. And if our job is to remove the cringe and the discomfort of puberty, it's like, no. There are tons of other hormones in the body doing lots of other jobs.
Okay. So you mentioned the sex hormones, and I want to get into the big five. So there are two in the brain that are responsible for getting the cycle rolling. And then they're very integral in all of the hormonal cycling of the sex hormones, and three out in the body, in the periphery. So you want to start with the two in the brain?
Sure. So the two in the brain are LH and FSH, and they are secreted by the pituitary. And they go to, and I love this so much. I love when we do our talk because it just makes everything feel like it makes so much sense. So if you have ovaries, they're sent to the ovaries, which, as a reminder, they're almond-shaped organs at the ends of the fallopian tubes, but not attached to the fallopian tubes, which is a very cool piece of information. Those are the factories, the sex hormone factories in female bodies. And in male bodies, LH and FSH go to the testicles, which are the testosterone factories. The ovaries produce progesterone and estrogen. And that's what LH and FSH tell the ovaries to start getting up and running. But the timeline for LH and FSH impacting ovaries and ovaries being up and running, it's not the same timeline as when the testicles get up and running as caused by LH and FSH in male bodies. And Cara, I don't know if you want to just mention a little bit about that.
Yeah. So we're going to go back up into the brain. So the pituitary gland releases a whole bunch of different hormones. Two of them are LH and FSH. The way the pituitary is signaled to release LH and FSH is by a different hormone, also in the brain, called GnRH, which stands for gonadotropin hormone releasing hormone. This is what starts the engine, GnRH release, and then LH and FSH start rolling and they go out to the, as Vanessa described, the ovaries or the testicles. So two things about timing. One is male puberty often goes unrecognized at first. And what I mean by at first is probably the first couple of years for many boys, males, because as LH and FSH are leaving the brain and going out into the body and telling the testicles to start producing testosterone, the testicles have to grow and get the machinery up and running to respond more and more and more aggressively to the LH and FSH signal. So if you're living in a body with testicles and LH and FSH are leaving the brain, the first reaction is not to produce a massive amount of testosterone. It's to produce a small amount of testosterone, which then tells the testicles grow and become a bigger and better machine for more and more testosterone. And over time, testosterone levels, the net testosterone levels goes up. We're going to talk about sort of the hour by hour is an up, down, up, down, up, down, but the net amount goes up. Now, arguably, LH and FSH take the same time in many ways to reach the ovaries and tell the ovaries to produce estrogen and progesterone. But we see estrogen and progesterone's effects much faster. So it doesn't take a whole lot of estrogen in the body, for instance, to start seeing breast budding. Estrogen loves to go to breast tissue and make breasts bud. And so it doesn't, to the best of our knowledge, it does not take a year or two of being in puberty, LH and FSH going to the ovaries to get enough estrogen up and running to see some physical changes. That's one thing. The second thing I want to say is, while estrogen and progesterone are made in the ovaries, and ovaries are excellent at making estrogen and progesterone, and while testosterone is made in the testicles, and testicles are excellent at making testosterone, those are not the only parts of the body that make those hormones. And this is extraordinarily important, right? Vanessa, do you want to get into it a little?
Yeah. So other parts of the body produce these hormones in particular, and this is so fascinating. There's a scientific term called peripheral fat conversion. And in the fat cells of the body, the hormones can be turned into estrogen. And the reason this becomes particularly interesting is there's two reasons. One, and we hear a lot about concerns about overweight and obese girls tipping into puberty earlier. And the theory is, and this is partially true, but also is unclear as to how dominant a role this phenomenon plays in the larger phenomenon of girls going to puberty earlier, is that if girls have more body fat, then that body fat, more of it can be converted into estrogen. And therefore, there's more estrogen in the body than just what's being produced normally around the body and particularly in the ovaries. And so the relative amount of estrogen in the body is higher theoretically than in a body that has less fat.
Yeah. So let me say it a slightly different way. That was perfect, by the way, but a slightly different way.
I'm feeling so affirmed in my.
Here, I mean, you just I'm like literally, we're going to get off this podcast and I'm going to give you an MD. So the body produces lots of different hormones, as we've talked about. We've talked on this podcast many times about adrenarche, the adrenal androgens. Those are hormones that are made by the adrenal glands that are like cousins of estrogen and testosterone. These are all very similarly structured hormones. And the adrenal androgens in particular, like DHEAS, those hormones, when they float out of the adrenal glands and into what we call the periphery, the rest of the body, the outside part of the body, the organs, tissues, et cetera, they can be aromatized. So aromatization is a chemical process where there's just a very slight shift in structure and DHEAS converts into a form of estrogen. And this is a very important piece of the puzzle Because if your adrenal glands are starting to produce a lot of DHEAS and there's a lot of fat tissue in the periphery, there is more aromatization, there is more conversion, peripheral fat conversion of DHEAS, for instance, into estrogen. And that happens in any body. It doesn't matter if
Right.
you've got ovaries or testicles. In female bodies with ovaries, it tips those females into puberty earlier because, exactly as you described, the relative amount of estrogen goes up faster than it will in a body that doesn't have as much fat tissue. I know the first time you learned this, your mind was so blown. In a male body, it actually can slow the onset of puberty. Do you want to explain why? You want me to explain why?
Yeah. I mean, for the same reason, which is the relative amount of estrogen in the body, relative in this case to theoretically rising testosterone levels, because they're relatively closer, the testosterone can't have the dominant role that it would play in a body that has less estrogen. And therefore, it essentially pauses or delays the onset of puberty because the brain is getting messages like, oh, this relative amount of estrogen and testosterone means this body isn't in puberty or shouldn't be in puberty. So it's really, really fascinating. This is an area where there's tons of research being done, where there's lots we don't yet know. Cara, can you talk about the way hormones are released, the pattern, the rising and falling? Because many of us would love to imagine that it's like a steady, gentle slope, like a moderate hike if you were on all trails.
Yeah, we did a newsletter maybe a couple of weeks ago. I can't remember how long ago, where we showed an image. And for members, just, you pop over into the membership and pull up the newsletter. For those who aren't members, this is a reason to become a member. You can pull up these old images that we put up that I think are really helpful visual representations. But what it shows is LH and FSH go out of the brain into the periphery, tell the ovaries to produce their hormones, the testicles to produce their hormones. Those hormone levels rise very quickly on the order of hours, 6, 8, 10 hours, they are rising quickly, which sends a signal back to the brain to say, there's enough here. You can turn off, the on switch can go to off. So the LH and FSH stop. Then the production of estrogen or testosterone stops. So those hormones start to fall on the order of hours. And then there's a signal sent up the brain. Nope, we need more. We need more. And so there is this up and down cycling that's not perfectly circadian, but happens, there are curves that look like it happens about twice a day, that these hormones kind of surge and peak and then drop. And if you look at the graph over years, it can look like a straight line up, where the net amount of either estrogen and progesterone or testosterone goes up over time in these bodies. But if you take a magnifying lens and you look down to the day, then what you begin to see is the actual curve is not a straight line. It's up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down. And if you're watching me on YouTube, you can see that the line is trending up over time, but every day by day, it's up, down, up, down. Why does that matter? It's because mood swings happen in the delta, in the difference between the up and the down. Okay, Vanessa, go.
So why are we spending so much time talking about this?
And explain the delta, go.
So the delta is, as Cara said, it can be on the order of hours, not on the order of days or weeks. And it's super important because a really common question we get is a mood swing a mood swing, or is a mood swing a concern? Should I be concerned about a kid's mental health? And what we always say, and lots of wonderful mental health professionals out there who can go deeper on this, but essentially, if the mood is changing, they're in a crummy mood in the morning and they come home and they're in a decent mood, and then late that night, maybe they're in a crummy mood again. Okay, you might be looking at mood swings, but if they're in a crummy mood in the morning and they're in a crummy mood in the night, and they wake up the next morning and they don't want to get out of bed, and then they get home from school the next day and they're still in a really crummy mood, and it's going over a few days, that is not a mood swing. something else is going on. And people will say, oh, well, for diagnosis, it needs to be 2 weeks. And, don't ever question your gut if you're concerned about a kid. If you're worried that something doesn't feel right, you don't have to wait 2 weeks. You can speak to your healthcare provider. You can speak to a guidance counselor at school. Worries that a mood swing is not a mood swing is a perfect opportunity to ask for help from trained professionals.
And what you're describing is this phenomenon where, as the hormones, the sex hormones, are rising and falling and rising and falling in the body, they're also crossing over into the fluid around the brain. They cross through this gate called the blood-brain barrier that's supposed to keep a lot of stuff away from the brain, but hormones cross it across the blood-brain barrier very quickly, most of them. And so the estrogen or the testosterone or whatever hormone we're talking about at the moment crosses over and bathes the brain. And then as levels drop, the relative amount of that hormone around the neurons of the brain goes down. And then as the hormones surge inside the brain, it goes up. So what the body is experiencing, the brain is experiencing, and you've described it exactly right. The behavior then tells the same story. Whereas when there's a mental health issue, some mental health issues are episodic like this, but in general, the timeline looks different. They are stretched out over a longer period of time. The highs, if you've got like a manic episode or a mood issue that's associated with being up, 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 it tends to stretch out, not always, but often longer than what we see with mood swings from normal sex hormone surges. And likewise, when you have low mood, and this is a perfect description that you gave, a kid whose energy is low, whose affect is flat, who's sad, who can't get out of bed, who doesn't want to engage with their friends and their regular activities, they're not going to pop up the next morning and be fine and then go back down again later that day when it's major depression that is underlying it for the most part. But again, just like Vanessa said, if you're not sure, you call your primary healthcare provider, a pediatrician, a family doctor, a nurse practitioner. You can call a counselor, a therapist, a psychiatrist, someone from school. School administrators are really actually getting very good at mental health assessments. We have lots of friends who work in mental health who we refer to all the time. Their podcasts are incredible. Listen to what they have to say. Elisa Pressman, Lisa D'Amour. There are people out there who are giving great advice about how to figure out if you have to worry about your kid's mental health. This is confusing because mood swings can look a lot like mental health issues.
And so let's spend the last few minutes talking about how we handle them. And handling them, it's not a monolith, right? Because sometimes a mood swing shows up like a tornado tearing through your kitchen, and the tornado is screaming and crying and throwing a backpack and storming out and storming back in, right? That's one version. And what we like to tell people in that case is if that kid is at a 10 or a 20, you don't want to meet them at a 10. You want to help bring them down. You want to help bring the mood down so that if there is something going on at some point in the next couple of hours, you can have a productive conversation about what's going on. And if there's nothing going on besides just a mood swing, at least everybody can kind of take a breath. So the hottest adult phrases to use are often the least helpful and least productive. And I worked with a huge group of middle schoolers and high schoolers a couple weeks ago, and they were hilarious in sharing their least favorite adult comments in reaction to their mood swings. But some of some of our favorites are like, you don't tell a kid to calm down because no one in the history of the world has ever calmed down because they were told to calm down. You don't tell them to be so dramatic because it feels like a really big deal to them, and it may seem dramatic to us, but to them it's real and it's happening, and that just invalidates their experience. You don't tell them to stop crying because also that never
Never
works.
works.
So, what can we do? How can we manage it? Number one is like, just don't engage. I mean, if you cannot help yourself, but to dive in and fix it, if you feel like you have to say something, and I'm one of those people, Cara, you're one of those people. That's why we have this podcast. Then just come up with some phrases where you can just validate the kid. Oof, looks like you had a tough day. Sounds like there's a lot going on. I'm here if you need me, right? You're just validating, validating, validating. And 99.9% of the time, Cara, what do kids just want us to do?
Listen.
Just listen.
I mean, we say this often on this podcast. It is so relevant to mood swings. Eliza Pressman, the wonderful prompt, are you looking for advice or do you just want me to listen? And if you actually ask a kid that, 99 times out of 100, they will say, I just want you to listen, and they will feel validated. I will say there are times where the behavior is so not okay that it's hard to validate, in which case I think you can either excuse them or excuse yourself from the situation, which is
100%.
fine.
100%. I mean, I think, I don't know if I've shared this with you, but I once left a crying child on a sidewalk in New York City. I mean, I didn't leave him and go home, but I took a few steps away from that child to gather myself, at which point I turned around and a good Samaritan had picked up the tantruming child and carried him towards me. And I was like, thank you so much, but I actually left him there on purpose. I don't think I said that. I just was thinking it. But the point is, sometimes you have to walk away, and there are kids who are going to follow you. I mean, there are kids, if you're like, hey, I got to take a minute, I'm just going to, I'll be back. There are kids whose mood swing will propel them to trail behind you in your home and continue to scream.
And lecture you. Yes.
And lecture you, harangue you. At which point, the best thing you can do is just breathe. You just take deep breaths, because not only are you calming yourself down, which in that moment is probably the most important thing, but you're also possibly co-regulating the kid depending on how far behind they are. Are they inches behind you? But if you're in a shared space with a kid and they just cannot get a grip, remember, they are not purposefully being assholes. They are not purposefully being jerks. They are the subject of their hormones. It's bathing their brain in a hormone stew. They are not choosing to do this. And I just want to remind people, because in a second, we're going to talk about anger and silence, another manifestation of mood swings. It doesn't feel good to them. They feel ashamed. They feel embarrassed. They feel out of control. And if we make them feel even worse about themselves by reacting in unkind ways, it only exacerbates it. So our job is to say to them, I can handle this.
Yep.
And I'm here. I'm not going to engage, but I am here. I'm not afraid of you. I'm not ashamed of you. I am here.
And this is not to say that you're giving them permission to behave this way, because there are so many follow-up conversations that can happen when the temperature comes down and the swing is over. And sometimes you wait a couple of hours, and sometimes you have to wait a couple of days. I mean, it really, sometimes in the heat of the moment, even though the mood swing will be over, like you're just not ready to go back there. But we do have a responsibility to the kids in our lives to go back and to annotate the situation, right? And to say, that wasn't okay. And this is why it wasn't okay and didn't feel okay. But you can't do it in the moment. I mean, you can, but it's not effective at all. So
the one time I do it in the moment is when a mood swing makes a sibling a target, as opposed to me. When it's me,
if there's a physical risk. So if there's ever a physical threat, then you need to shut it down. But we're talking about, yes, just like a kid who is emotionally, unleashing on.
Right. I hate you. Why can't you help me? You never make any sense. You suck, whatever. Or it has nothing to do with you. And they're just,
and the
flailing.
revisiting of that cannot be shaming, even if what they said was extraordinarily hurtful. And you may need help from a mental health provider to guide some of these conversations, because we do not come at this from the mental health standpoint. We know a lot about mental health, but we're not mental health care providers. There's a lot of good advice about how to get through those conversations and when you kind of need an intermediary to help you. But the goal is not to shame them for what they said. The goal is to teach them the science. So when they are in a place where they are calm and you are calm, one of the things on the path to validation is to say, hey, I want you to understand how your brain works during puberty. And give them our book and let them read the chapter. It is written in a way that someone with an 8th or 9th grade reading level and an interest in reading can take it and read quickly. We have lots of videos up there. Lots of other people who have lots of videos. Just watch them. Make sure it's good science that is explaining the why of it. But if they understand the science, they feel validated.
Totally.
They feel seen.
Totally.
But let's go to anger and silence, because this is an important one.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll tee it up a little and just say hormone swings look like a lot of different things in a lot of different bodies. And sometimes they are loud and aggressive and, the emotions are worn on the sleeve. And other times, quite frankly, they are silent and they're steely. It's a slammed door or a turned back or crossed arms. And that can be just as aggressive in terms of the manifestation of a mood swing as anything else. Right?
And hurtful. I mean,
Yes.
Painful and hurtful, even though they're not purposefully doing it.
Yes.
To hurt us. And one of the things, Cara, we hear from parents so often is, my kid was so loving and so available to me and so expressive. And now he's so silent and I feel like there's a wall between us. And there's a real grief in experiencing a kid's mood swings of that type, because it feels like a loss. And I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about strategies that you recommend.
Yeah. I mean, what's interesting about when a kid's personality is already skewed towards being the silent type, and then hormones, particularly in my lived experience, it's testosterone that does this more than estrogen, but certainly there are lots of people with lots of estrogen who do this. The silent treatment approach to mood swings can be really, really painful. And I find that unlike when they're at an 11 and really highly verbal, when they're silent, engaging them is actually kind of important. And it's how we engage them and telling them that we're here. And so you always say, if they're in the room, they can hear you. So if their back is turned to you, if their arms are crossed, they can hear you. Now, the more you talk, the less they listen. So choose your words carefully and be brief. I say, as a podcaster who doesn't shut her mouth.
And also, Cara, you don't actually have to talk. I mean, sometimes the best times with my kid is when we're all just sitting there and we're not actually talking about anything or doing, maybe we're petting the dog, but like
sometimes I want a hug. That's and frankly, that's not going to work for my child who has gone totally silent at the moment. That works for me because I'm like, I have to express myself somehow.
You're
but
like,
that is,
what would make me feel better.
Right. And this is not about me. Sitting on the other side of the door. That's been my biggest, it was when my son was younger. If he would go into his room and slam the door, I learned from Lisa D'Amour long ago that when they create a boundary, they're really trying to create the boundary, and you have to acknowledge that. So sometimes they close the door because they actually don't want you in there. But going to the other side of the door and just saying, I am here. I am here. I care. And I'm just going to sit here for 5 or 10 minutes. And if you have something you want to say, I'm here. And as I started practicing that skill, what I noticed was the better I got at getting comfortable with silence, the more forthcoming. But it's interesting to me, Vanessa, because I also think that kids who skew towards silence by temperament, they are kids who sometimes think that time solves all feelings. And if they just sit with things for long enough, that the time will make things pass and go away. And that's because they're not engaging the people around them and they're not processing through language. And sometimes time is a really nice salve. But the dirty little secret that we all know as adults is really you have to work through it. You have to talk through it.
It's got to come out. I mean, the last piece of advice that we'll close with, and this applies to a kid who was really angry. This applies to a silent kid, is when you try to engage them, like when they get home from school or band practice or sports practice and they're exhausted and dirty and hungry and all they want to do is eat dinner and have a shower. Like, we have to remember, just as those of us who are living with partners and spouses, we've learned over many years of marriage to pick our moments. And the same is true of kids. And I have found that kids, we've talked about this with Lisa and some other folks, but late at night, when our melatonin has risen and theirs has not, and they are ready to chat and we are low energy, that is the opportunity to have conversations with the ones who may not be as forthcoming at other points of the day, who may have more sensitive dispositions, who may feel their hunger more strongly or their tiredness more strongly. And so being around, staying up 10 or 15 minutes later, having them come in and say goodnight to you, having
that
them.
One, it's what Lisa says when they call the meeting, like you're in bed. I can't even tell you how many times this has happened to me. You're in bed, you're ready to go to sleep, and they wander in and stand next to your bed and start talking. I love that framing that she has. They're calling the meeting. And why are they doing it then? Because you're not going to engage at high energy. And they're the one who is standing, you're laying down. And so they end the meeting when they're ready to end the meeting and they leave. And the learned lesson that I finally got, was if you're not done with the meeting, don't get out of bed and finish the meeting with them, right? Like it is a really powerful thing to let them be in charge of that conversation.
And if for some reason you have a kid who's not coming in to say goodnight to you, then you go in and say goodnight to them and lay down on their bed, stare at the ceiling, maybe don't say much of anything, and see what comes out. Like there's a power in intentional silence and in patient waiting, and just see what comes out. So I hope this is, I mean, I could talk about this subject forever and ever and ever. It's so central to the experience of raising kids this age. I hope this gives many of you hope, new tools, new science and information to feel more empowered and more capable of managing mood swings, because this version of mood swings, they don't last forever. They will pass.
And I'm going to give a teaser for a future episode that I know we need to do. Would love to hear from listeners about your thoughts on this. There are things that exacerbate mood swings, right? We know lack of sleep exacerbates mood swings. We know poor diet, both being hungry, not eating enough, right? And eating crappy food, eating high sugar, high processed food, pro-inflammatory foods exacerbates mood swings. We need to talk about how we manage our own environments and how we teach our kids to manage theirs, not how we manage their environments, how we teach them to manage theirs so that they can have the skills to feed themselves well, to get themselves to bed, and to do the things they need to do to create an ecosystem where, as their hormones continue to rise and fall through their life, especially their adolescence and young adulthood, they are minimizing all the other external influences that make mood swings feel even worse. So we'll come back with a part 2, but we want questions from you specifically about.
And I'll add, too much time spent online can also impact moods. So 100%. We'll do a future episode. It could be like the 4 pillars of health and impacting moods. That title needs a little work, but you know what I mean.
That's not great for SEO.
No. no, it needs a little needs a little work. Cara, until next time, always a pleasure.
Bye, Vanessa.
Bye. Thank you so much for listening. You can email us with questions, feedback, or episode requests at podcast@lessawkward.com.
If you want to learn more about what we do to make this whole stage of life less awkward for everyone involved, our parent membership, our school health ed curriculum, our keynote talks, and more are all at lessawkward.com.
And if you want products that make puberty so much more comfortable, visit myumla.com.